How do crimes survive when powerful people are watching? And what happens when silence isn't simply the absence of noise, but something carefully constructed, protected, and maintained behind closed doors? What if the most dangerous criminals are not the ones hiding in shadows, but the ones standing comfortably inside the brightest rooms, surrounded by influence, wealth, and admiration, while their victims remain invisible to the very systems designed to protect them? New here? Don't forget to subscribe and tap the bell so you won't miss any of our latest videos. Jeffrey Epstein's rise into elite social circles did not happen overnight, nor did it happen quietly. It unfolded through a carefully cultivated image of financial brilliance, social charm, and philanthropic connection that allowed him to move seamlessly among billionaires, politicians, celebrities, and global power brokers, creating an aura of legitimacy that few dared to question. And as Epstein's reputation expanded, so did his access to environments where influence could suppress scrutiny, allowing allegations to surface only in fragments, whispers that struggled to compete against the deafening authority of wealth and social prestige. And long before Epstein's name became globally synonymous with exploitation and trafficking, early warning signs were already emerging through police complaints and local investigations, particularly during the early 2000s in Florida, where multiple reports described disturbing encounters involving underage girls recruited under the promise of money, opportunity, or mentorship. Allegations that, when viewed collectively, revealed patterns that should have triggered immediate alarm. Yet those warnings seemed to stall inside a complex web of legal negotiation, institutional hesitation, and social intimidation, creating a chilling contrast between the gravity of the accusations and the relatively muted public response they received at the time. And investigative records later revealed that Florida law enforcement agencies had gathered testimony from multiple young victims whose stories shared unsettling similarities, describing recruitment pipelines involving intermediaries who introduced them to Epstein under misleading pretenses. Yet, despite the accumulation of these accounts, the case would eventually result in a controversial plea agreement that many critics later described as unusually lenient given the scale and severity of the allegations, raising a haunting question that continues to echo through every discussion of Epstein's crimes. If credible complaints and investigative leads existed years before global exposure, why did those warnings fail to stop him? And was it simply bureaucratic failure, legal complexity, or something far more disturbing involving institutional reluctance to confront individuals protected by extraordinary wealth and influence? Media reporting from that period documented the initial allegations with growing concern, highlighting inconsistencies between the volume of complaints and the outcome of legal proceedings. Yet those reports struggled to penetrate mainstream awareness, often overshadowed by Epstein's public persona as a financier connected to philanthropic initiatives and elite social gatherings, illustrating how public image can act as a powerful shield that reframes perception, allowing audiences to dismiss allegations as isolated incidents rather than recognizing them as indicators of systematic exploitation. And criminology experts studying cases involving high-status offenders have frequently observed a psychological phenomenon where society instinctively grants credibility to individuals associated with wealth, education, or political connection, creating subconscious resistance to believing accusations that contradict established narratives of success and respectability. A bias that can delay investigations and silence victims who fear disbelief or retaliation. And behavioral researchers have documented how victims of powerful offenders often experience heightened vulnerability due to social intimidation, financial disparity, and fear of reputational destruction, barriers that can discourage reporting or fragment testimony into isolated complaints that fail to trigger systemic investigation. And Epstein's network, as later court-confirmed victim testimonies would reveal, operated through layers of recruitment, secrecy, and normalization, where exploitative behavior was disguised as mentorship or professional opportunity, further complicating the ability of victims to recognize or articulate their experiences as criminal abuse. Yet, even as these dynamics unfolded, journalists and investigative reporters continued documenting emerging allegations, creating a growing archive of evidence that would later form the foundation of renewed investigations, though at the time, their reporting often struggled against the inertia created by Epstein's social and financial influence. And as the years progressed, the gap between allegation and accountability widened, allowing Epstein to expand his network, travel internationally, and maintain relationships with individuals occupying positions of extraordinary authority, reinforcing public fear that wealth can function not merely as privilege, but as insulation against exposure. A fear rooted in historical cases where institutional power structures failed to confront predatory behavior until external pressure forced accountability. And as Epstein's story eventually exploded into global headlines following renewed investigative journalism and federal prosecution efforts, the public began reevaluating the earlier years of ignored warnings, recognizing patterns that had been visible long before the scandal reached international attention, prompting widespread reflection about the role of silence in sustaining systemic abuse, whether that silence was maintained through legal maneuvering, social pressure, or institutional complacency. And as investigative timelines are reconstructed, each overlooked complaint and delayed response began forming a disturbing narrative showing how crimes can survive not through invisibility, but through normalization, through environments where questioning powerful figures becomes socially or professionally dangerous. And this realization created a lasting emotional anchor that continues haunting public consciousness, the fear that predators operating within elite networks may exploit trust, admiration, and influence as protective camouflage, allowing abuse to persist while victims struggle to be heard. And as audiences examine Epstein's early history through the lens of hindsight, one question continues resurfacing with unsettling urgency. If credible warnings, police reports, and journalistic investigations existed years before Epstein's eventual downfall, what prevented those warnings from triggering decisive action? And more importantly, how many similar warnings in other cases might still be lingering unheard, buried beneath layers of institutional hesitation and societal disbelief? Because if early warnings existed and failed to stop him, the most frightening possibility may not be how Epstein operated, but how easily systems designed to prevent exploitation can be overwhelmed when influence and wealth quietly shape who gets questioned and who remains protected.
How did Jeffrey Epstein manage to recruit victims repeatedly across cities and countries without triggering widespread exposure? And what happens when exploitation hides behind charm, familiarity, and carefully constructed trust? What if the most dangerous element of a criminal operation is not secrecy alone, but the ability to appear safe, respectable, and socially connected? As investigations into Epstein's activities expanded, attention increasingly turned toward a figure whose presence added both legitimacy and access to his world. Ghislaine Maxwell, a woman born into privilege, raised within elite international social circles, and deeply embedded in environments where wealth, influence, and exclusivity shaped personal relationships. And Maxwell's background provided her with a unique ability to move comfortably among high-profile individuals, cultivating connections that extended across political, financial, and social landscapes, allowing her to function as both a gatekeeper and facilitator within Epstein's inner network. and federal indictment records later described Maxwell as playing a critical role in identifying, approaching, and recruiting young girls, often presenting herself as a friendly, sophisticated mentor figure who could offer opportunities, guidance, or introductions into elite environments. An approach that weaponized personal trust by masking predatory intentions beneath gestures of kindness and familiarity. And court testimony from multiple verified victims revealed chillingly consistent patterns describing how Maxwell allegedly built rapport through casual conversation, gifts, promises of career advancement, or emotional reassurance, gradually normalizing inappropriate behavior while minimizing fear or suspicion, creating recruitment pipelines that relied not on force but on psychological manipulation and social grooming. And these testimonies illustrated how victims were often introduced to Epstein through Maxwell's presence, a dynamic that reduced perceived danger because Maxwell's demeanor projected comfort, safety, and authority, highlighting a deeply disturbing strategy where exploitation was disguised as social acceptance, mentorship, or opportunity. And prosecutors argued during federal proceedings that Maxwell's role extended beyond recruitment, describing her as an organizer who helped structure environments where abuse could occur, coordinating schedules, managing logistics, and maintaining social networks that shielded Epstein's activities behind layers of normalcy. While defense arguments attempted to challenge the credibility and interpretation of these accusations, the court ultimately found Maxwell guilty of multiple charges related to trafficking and exploitation, reinforcing the prosecution's portrayal of her involvement in facilitating Epstein's criminal enterprise. And behavioral psychologists analyzing the case emphasize that predators often rely on trusted intermediaries to reduce resistance, particularly when targeting vulnerable individuals who may be more inclined to trust authority figures or social mentors, demonstrating how personal relationships can become tools of control when manipulated by individuals operating within positions of influence. And the emotional weight of this revelation fuels one of the most unsettling fears surrounding the Epstein operation: the realization that trust itself, a fundamental human survival mechanism, was systematically exploited to silence suspicion and sustain abuse, raising broader questions about how society evaluates credibility, safety, and authority within elite environments. And as federal court records and victim testimonies continue documenting the structured recruitment methods that sustained Epstein's network, the haunting uncertainty remains. If recruitment depended so heavily on trust, familiarity, and social credibility, how many warning signs may have been dismissed as harmless interactions? How many red flags were overlooked because they appeared wrapped in sophistication and privilege? And how often can predators operate undetected when their greatest weapon is not secrecy, but the confidence of those who believe they are safe?
Long before the Epstein case dominated global headlines, there were voices attempting to be heard. Their accounts emerged quietly in police reports, civil complaints, and private testimonies, often met with hesitation, doubt, or overwhelming resistance. The deeper tragedy investigators later uncovered was not only the abuse itself, but the pattern of warnings that appeared to fade before reaching public accountability. Several survivors would later describe their initial attempts to report misconduct during the early 2000s. In Palm Beach, Florida, one complaint in particular triggered a local police investigation after a parent reported that her teenage daughter had been recruited to provide massages at Epstein's residence. Detectives who interviewed the girl documented allegations of inappropriate sexual conduct. As investigators expanded interviews, additional young women came forward with similar accounts, describing a recruitment pattern that mirrored each other's experiences. Despite these statements, victims later said they encountered intense pressure that extended beyond legal challenges. Civil lawsuits filed by survivors described environments where intimidation became a persistent barrier. Some reported being contacted by representatives linked to Epstein's legal team and urged to remain silent. Others described feeling socially isolated, fearing retaliation, or believing that Epstein's wealth and connections made justice unlikely. Court filings from subsequent civil cases suggested that settlement offers were sometimes presented to victims. While settlements are not admissions of guilt, survivors later testified that the agreements often included confidentiality clauses, limiting their ability to speak publicly. For many, this created a second layer of silence, one enforced not by force, but by legal constraint and financial imbalance. Media coverage during these early years also remained limited. Some journalists later stated that verifying allegations involving powerful figures presented editorial and legal risks. Reporting on accusations without completed prosecutions often required substantial corroboration, and in Epstein's case, the combination of private settlements and confidential agreements restricted the availability of public documentation. As a result, survivor claims struggled to gain sustained national attention during the earliest stages of the investigation. Public interviews given years later revealed the emotional weight survivors carried during this period. Several described feeling as though their reports had been minimized or delayed by systems designed to protect due process, but, in their experience, also protected influence. Their testimonies consistently reflected a shared fear that wealth, legal resources, and elite social connections created an environment where speaking out felt both dangerous and futile. The moral tension surrounding the case intensified as more survivors began sharing nearly identical recruitment patterns, descriptions of abuse, and accounts of failed early reporting attempts. Each testimony added to a growing question that investigators, journalists, and the public would eventually confront. If victims had spoken years earlier, if complaints had reached law enforcement, if lawsuits had already documented allegations, what changed that finally forced the world to listen? When Jeffrey Epstein died in federal custody, many believed the possibility of courtroom answers died with him. But investigators were already turning toward another figure whose name had surfaced repeatedly across victim testimonies and legal filings. The arrest of Ghislaine Maxwell in July 2020 reignited the possibility that the hidden mechanics of Epstein's operation might finally be exposed. But as her case unfolded, a deeper and more unsettling question began forming beneath the headlines. Was this trial going to reveal the entire structure of the alleged network, or just confirm fragments of a much larger system that still remained in shadow? Maxwell, a British socialite with deep ties to elite international circles, was arrested in New Hampshire following a federal investigation that had quietly tracked her movements for nearly a year. Prosecutors charged her with multiple counts related to sex trafficking of minors, alleging she played a central role in identifying, grooming, and recruiting underage girls for Epstein over several years. According to federal indictments, Maxwell was not simply an associate, but allegedly an active facilitator who helped normalize Epstein's behavior by building trust with victims and presenting herself as a mentor figure before abuse occurred. Her trial began in November 2021 in federal court in New York and quickly became one of the most closely watched criminal proceedings in recent memory. Prosecutors built their case around survivor testimony, flight records, photographs, and financial documentation. Several women took the stand and described how Maxwell allegedly gained their confidence through conversations about education, careers, and personal development before gradually introducing them to Epstein. Testimony described patterns of recruitment that prosecutors argued demonstrated calculated psychological manipulation designed to remove suspicion and create dependency.
Defense attorneys argued Maxwell was being unfairly blamed for Epstein's crimes and portrayed her as someone operating within Epstein's influence rather than directing operations herself. The trial became a legal battleground not only about individual guilt, but about how responsibility is defined within complex criminal conspiracies involving power, wealth, and social influence. Throughout proceedings, Maxwell maintained her innocence, and her defense repeatedly challenged witness credibility and questioned investigative methods used by federal prosecutors. In December 2021, after weeks of testimony and deliberation, a federal jury convicted Maxwell on multiple counts, including sex trafficking conspiracy and transporting minors for illegal sexual activity. The verdict was seen by many as a significant moment of accountability, particularly for survivors who had spent years attempting to have their experiences recognized within the criminal justice system. In June 2022, Maxwell was sentenced to 20 years in federal prison, with sentencing documentation emphasizing her role in facilitating abuse and enabling Epstein's access to victims. For survivors, the conviction carried emotional weight. Many publicly described the verdict as validation after years of dismissal, intimidation, and legal obstacles. Victim impact statements delivered during sentencing described long-term psychological trauma and life disruptions tied directly to the alleged recruitment system prosecutors argued Maxwell helped construct. The courtroom became not only a legal arena, but a space where survivors confronted a figure they believed had been central to their exploitation. Yet, even as the conviction closed one chapter, it opened another wave of uncertainty. The trial focused primarily on Maxwell's role and specific victim accounts presented in court, but prosecutors never introduced a full map of every alleged associate, contact, or individual who may have interacted with Epstein's operations. Legal limitations, evidentiary standards, and the narrow focus required for criminal conviction meant the courtroom narrative addressed particular charges rather than presenting a complete operational blueprint. Public curiosity intensified around documents referenced during proceedings, including contact books, flight logs, and witnesses referencing to high-profile social connections. While some names surfaced in civil filings and investigative reporting over the years, being mentioned in documentation never equated to criminal charges or verified participation in wrongdoing. This distinction created a tension between legal accountability and public speculation, leaving many observers wondering whether the conviction represented closure or merely confirmation that a larger and more complex network might never be fully documented. Maxwell's legal team later filed appeals challenging aspects of the trial, including jury selection and procedural rulings, keeping portions of the case active within appellate courts. These ongoing legal debates continue to shape how the trial is interpreted within broader discussions about due process, prosecutorial strategy, and the limits of conspiracy prosecutions involving multiple alleged actors across international boundaries. Law enforcement officials have consistently stated that investigations tied to Epstein's activities remain open in various forms, though public updates have been limited. Survivors, advocates, and legal analysts continue debating whether the Maxwell conviction delivered meaningful justice or highlighted how difficult it is to fully expose crimes that allegedly intersect with wealth, influence, and global mobility. Because the verdict answered one critical legal question, but it left another far more unsettling question lingering in the public imagination. If one accomplice was convicted, how large was the operation truly? Why do certain criminal investigations refuse to stay confined within courtrooms and instead explode into endless speculation across the internet? Why do some cases evolve beyond evidence and testimony, transforming into sprawling webs of theories that stretch far beyond verified facts? And perhaps most unsettling of all, what happens when public hunger for answers begins to outrun the pace of real investigations? The Epstein case, even after arrests, trials, and convictions, ignited one of the most intense waves of conspiracy speculation in modern criminal history. And as details surfaced through court documents, media reports, and survivor testimony, online communities began constructing connections that extended far beyond the boundaries of confirmed evidence. Almost immediately following Epstein's arrest in 2019, social media platforms experienced a surge of viral posts attempting to link him to unrelated criminal cases, political figures, celebrity networks, and unsolved investigations spanning decades, creating an environment where speculation often traveled faster than fact-checking could contain it. Verified media organizations and investigative journalists repeatedly published reports clarifying which allegations were supported by documented legal filings and which claims lacked any evidentiary basis. Yet the speed of digital information sharing allowed rumors to multiply in ways that traditional reporting structures struggled to counter, creating a cycle where each unanswered question became fuel for new theories, and each theory created further public distrust toward official investigations. Law enforcement agencies and federal investigators publicly warned that widespread misinformation surrounding high-profile cases could complicate real investigative work, emphasizing that false claims, fabricated documents, and manipulated images not only mislead the public, but can also overwhelm investigators with false leads, diverting resources away from credible evidence and potentially delaying justice for actual victims. The psychological mechanics behind these conspiracy surges reveal a deeper pattern tied to human behavior itself, because when crimes involve wealth, influence, or institutional failures, the public often assumes hidden layers must exist beyond what official investigations reveal, creating a mindset where absence of information becomes interpreted as proof of concealment rather than the result of ongoing investigative limitations. Social media amplification accelerates this phenomenon by rewarding emotionally charged content, especially narratives involving secrecy, power, and betrayal, allowing viral speculation to gain traction even when contradicted by verified records. Throughout the Epstein investigation, numerous viral posts attempted to connect his crimes to unrelated cold cases and public tragedies, including attempts by online communities to link his network to individuals and events with no documented connection within federal case filings or court proceedings, prompting fact-checking organizations to repeatedly publish verification reports debunking fabricated photographs, altered flight logs, and misrepresented witness statements circulating across platforms like X, TikTok, and online forums. Despite repeated corrections, the emotional intensity surrounding Epstein's crimes created fertile ground for conspiracy growth because the scale of confirmed abuse already challenged public understanding, making it psychologically easier for audiences to accept expanded theories rather than confront the complexity of verified facts alone. This phenomenon highlights how high-profile criminal cases can transform into symbolic representations of broader societal fears, particularly fears that powerful individuals can operate beyond accountability, fears that justice systems can be manipulated, and fears that institutional transparency may be incomplete. These anxieties, while emotionally understandable, can create dangerous cycles where speculation begins overshadowing documented evidence, blurring the line between legitimate investigative curiosity and narrative construction driven by distrust. Media analysts studying misinformation virality have documented how emotionally charged allegations, especially those involving children, power, and secrecy, generate significantly higher engagement online, creating algorithm-driven reinforcement loops where conspiracy content spreads more rapidly than factual reporting. And as audiences repeatedly encounter speculative narratives, those narratives can begin to feel credible through repetition alone. Law enforcement agencies, including federal investigative bodies, have issued public statements urging caution when evaluating claims circulating online, reminding the public that verified victim lists, court testimony, and prosecutorial evidence undergo rigorous legal scrutiny, while viral allegations often originate from anonymous sources lacking documentation. Yet these warnings frequently struggle to match the emotional pull of conspiracy storytelling that promises hidden revelations and secret truths. The danger within this cycle extends beyond public confusion, because misinformation can also re-traumatize survivors whose experiences risk being overshadowed by fabricated claims or exaggerated narratives that distort the reality of documented abuse, creating additional emotional harm for individuals whose testimonies formed the foundation of criminal prosecutions. Survivors and victim advocacy groups have repeatedly emphasized that false associations can weaken public focus on confirmed crimes, potentially undermining the credibility of real victims and shifting attention away from ongoing legal accountability efforts. Meanwhile, investigative agencies continue working within strict evidentiary standards, often unable to publicly address speculative claims due to legal constraints, which can unintentionally fuel further suspicion among audiences expecting instant transparency. This tension between investigative procedure and public demand for instant answers creates a vacuum where conspiracy theories thrive, particularly when investigations involve multiple jurisdictions, sealed documents, or ongoing appeals that limit public disclosure. The Epstein case illustrates how modern digital ecosystems allow criminal investigations to evolve into cultural phenomena shaped not only by evidence, but by collective fear, distrust, and curiosity amplified through social media algorithms and viral storytelling patterns. And as conspiracy theories multiply, they create a haunting paradox where the louder speculation becomes, the harder it may be for verified truths to maintain visibility within public discourse, raising an unsettling possibility that extends far beyond one case alone. Because if conspiracy theories grow louder with every unanswered question, could real truths eventually become harder to find?
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss an update. Drop a like and comment below. I want to hear your thoughts. Join our community and let's make this journey together.